Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. We are going to interrupt our regularly scheduled programming today because we're going to talk about this amazing book, Unacceptable, all about the Varsity Blues scandal, which many of you may have forgotten about, or maybe not. But if you have no idea what we're talking about, haven't forgotten about it, or have never heard of it, you need to pick up this book. And joining me today is Melissa Korn, who, with her co-author Jennifer Levitz, wrote this book. Hi, Melissa.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. And I love
Ah,
that you have all those post-it notes and tabs in the book.
yeah, absolutely. And actually, I ripped out like three-quarters of them out before we talked today. So, obviously, it's a little inside baseball for me to read this because, as a former admissions officer, I know a lot of the things. And in the work that I do now, I'm in this world. So, of course, for me, I think it's inside baseball. But honestly, I would recommend this book to anyone. For our listeners, just really quickly, Melissa is covers the higher ed beat, if you will, at the Wall Street Journal, and writes a lot of really interesting articles with great information. In fact, you have one, was it this week or last, where you were talking about what we see happening with the regular decisions this year, right?
Yeah, I'm just really glad I don't have a high school senior at the moment.
Yeah.
It's just madness this spring. It really is. And it's going to be heartbreaking and just so complicated and fraught and a really rough few months here for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you are very right about that. I have a high school junior, and I similarly have been sort of thanking God on pretty much a regular basis that he's not going to be applying this year for a number of reasons. Last year's group of seniors and this year's group of seniors are really caught in the crossfire of things that clearly have nothing to do with them and everything to do with the world that we're in right now, namely the pandemic. But before there was a pandemic, there was a massive scandal. And in fact, when Melissa and I were going back and forth about her appearance on the show today, I was reminded that literally a year ago, she and I were sitting talking about was meant to kind of be a hey, what's going on with Varsity Blues a year later, and instead it was a oh my goodness, this school is sending kids home and COVID, and what is this going to look like? And then I don't know, within a week we were quarantining at home, and this whole new thing started.
Right. It was one of my last in-person meetings
Yeah,
for a year.
it was. And in fact, I went from that meeting with you to a meeting with a student who was based in New York City. And we kind of went back and forth about should we do it in person, should we not do it in person? And ultimately, we were like, let's just do it in person. We were all still sort of denying, I think, the reality of what was happening. Obviously, we were, right?
Absolutely.
Um, but for our listeners' sake, and just anyone who's, I don't know, been living under a rock, wasn't paying attention in 2019, take us through the basics of this, of Unacceptable and the Varsity Blues scandal.
Yeah, it does feel like forever ago, doesn't it? But it
It
was
does.
really just over 2 years ago. So March 12th, 2019, prosecutors in Boston laid out this really complicated, sprawling scheme. And they said it was the largest college admissions case ever prosecuted by the Justice Department. Essentially, this college counselor, Rick Singer, initially based up in Sacramento and then down in Orange County, California, he ran a large counseling business, kind of traditional stuff. He had people who did some test prep, who essay writing, essay coaching, coming up with a list, all the usual stuff. And then he had this whole menu of illicit options as well that you could
Yes.
order from.
I love that. The menu,
The
but you were
daily
right.
specials.
Yeah.
And so there were two main things that he did through the illegal operation. The first had to do with standardized tests. He would encourage his clients' kids to get tested for learning differences so they could get additional time, enough additional time they could take the test at a different testing site entirely. And Singer paid off the test site administrators at two places to look the other way when a proctor he paid off
Right.
would go in and then fix the kids' test scores, test answers.
Right.
So he might, after the fact, like erase some bad stuff and fix it on the Scantron. In some cases, he just fed the kids the answers if the kids were in on it.
Mm-hmm.
And they would boost their score, not by so much that it would raise red flags with colleges, or the College Board or the ACT, but enough that it would maybe give them a nice little edge in applying to schools. But there was no guarantee there, right?
Right.
Guaranteed score, but no guaranteed admission. The other side, the other prong has to do with athletic recruiting, which
Hmm.
is much closer to a guarantee. And that was one of the things that was so appealing about it. So Singer called this his side door, and he would pitch these teens as star athletes, even when they weren't, even when sometimes they didn't even play the sport at all.
Right.
He would craft these fake resumes, these athletic profiles, Photoshop a kid onto some other athlete, so it looked like,
Yes.
you know, me in the pool, or here's me pole vaulting mid jump, and uh, he would work with college coaches for these teams, which are a little more kind of under the radar teams, not football or basketball. And they would get some money, or their program would get some money, and they would flag these kids as recruits. The admissions office took their word for it that they were, quality players, and
Right.
they got in. They would get their likely letter in the fall and their admissions letter. And once they got their likely letter, they would kind of make the next round of payments to Rick Singer. And it was a very sweet deal for all of them. It was a lot less expensive than trying to, buy a building on some campus.
Right. Which, as is noted a few times, there aren't any guarantees, and also the colleges don't really like the idea of a quid pro quo. And here you have a
Yeah.
bunch of wealthy people who are used to being able to write a check and make what they want to make happen. And that was obviously incredibly appealing about what Rick Singer put in front of them, even though, and especially as we read in the book, they knew that this was completely not on the up and up and totally a bad thing to do, a wrong thing to do.
And I think this is the point at which I give the disclaimer. There are some parents who have pleaded not guilty.
Yes.
They're expected to go to trial this fall. The trial has been delayed a few times. And that's part of their defense is, I didn't know this was illegal. This was just kind of an extreme version of what plenty of people do, making donations to a college, supporting an athletic program
Right.
in the hopes that you get some special treatment.
Right. Except that they knew that the money. I did like, there are a couple of parents that you highlight in the book who walk away when they realize, and there was one guy who just kind of dug a little bit deeper and said, well, who's getting the check?
Right.
And they said, well, the check goes to the coach. And he says, okay, I'm out, because he knows,
Right.
wait a second, that's
It's
not where
one,
the check is supposed to be going, right?
right. Maybe it feels a little bit less icky. That's a technical term for it, right? The icky.
Mm-hmm.
If you're giving money and it's going to new uniforms or for travel costs for the team or something like that, or if your kid is actually kind of a borderline player. And we came across some cases, at UCLA in particular, a decade ago, where this
Mm-hmm.
was an issue, where families were making these pledges right around the time their decent but not fantastic athlete was
Mm-hmm.
getting in as an athlete.
Right, right. It's yeah, it's tricky stuff. And I guess one thing I did want to talk a little bit more about is, what in your opinion are some of the contributing factors to, I think we've covered a couple sort of on the slide, but how did this, what allowed something like this to happen? What created the opportunity?
Yeah, there's a lot of blame to go around here, I think.
Yes.
So, in terms of kind of institutions, we can place some blame on the colleges and universities for not doing a very good job keeping tabs on who's being admitted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not asking questions, not fact checking applications. And when these schools are getting so many applications, you can't really expect them to call the school principal and confirm that somebody was the president of the science club and not the vice president, or that they actually volunteered at that place. You just have to take someone's word for it. The Common App asks you to sign and say, yes, this is true. And at some point,
Right.
the university just has to say, okay, I'm going to believe them. uh, so the fact that they didn't really check any of that stuff, they trusted the coaches so much, because why would a coach flag someone as a recruit if they weren't going to help the team?
Right.
So that autonomy that the coaches had was really quite extraordinary at some schools. So that's the universities that we can blame. You can blame the testing organizations for kind of being pretty hands off in terms of who actually administers the tests, the fact that this guy could become a proctor, and there was actually more than one proctor on Rick Singer's payroll. Um, and then we can also, I think, blame high schools for
Hmm.
some of this, for setting the stage for families to think that any action this extreme was necessary
Hmm.
to make sure their kids succeeded. Right? We've got high schools sending very mixed messages about what success means. We want our kids to find the right fit. We want them to go to a college where they'll flourish and follow their passion and grow into wonderful adults. But on our website, when we talk about college counseling, we're only going to highlight the ones who got into Ivies.
Right. And actually, one thing I would like to point out is mostly what you're talking about there is we're talking about those private schools where they're charging, right?
Yes.
30,000, 35, 40, $50,000 or more. And those are the schools where those mixed messages are found most prevalently, I would
And
say.
I would say public schools in particularly affluent areas as well,
Right.
but not all public schools, and not all private schools. But at some point, like, that is what the families are buying when they're paying tuition to those schools, right? It's the path to these elite universities.
Right.
Uh,
They,
so
they think they are, and so here's where
that's true.
my
Fair.
here's where I kick in too, because obviously the parents also bear some responsibility here too, right? Because I was struck by Jack Buckingham, whose mother, Jane Buckingham, which is sort of interesting too, because she's 2 years ahead of me in college, and when I moved to New York City, she was like I worked in marketing and PR at the time, and she was this amazing person that makes you ask yourself, like, geez, like, what have I done lately? She'd
Right.
created and sold a company, and so here's this kid. He has identified a school that he loves, that he's competitive at, that his mom actually likes too, and yet
And yet,
they
yeah,
get sucked in. And I shouldn't say they, because really I think the blame here lies with the mom, gets sucked into the idea that USC would be better.
right.
And it's that's, I think, a societal thing, the idea that the school that is less likely to take you is the one that is better.
Right. And let's just say clearly, a school that is more selective is not necessarily better. It's
Right.
just more selective, right? It might have just done a really good job at marketing
Yes.
and bumping up application numbers while keeping the class size the same, with the sole goal of becoming more selective and kind of going up a notch in the rankings or in just people's minds. Oh, they now have a different set of peer schools. That does not mean that they got better.
Right.
Maybe they did, but not
But maybe not.
necessarily. Right.
Exactly. Well, and I like, there's a moment in the book, and I've got a sticky note, and I actually even underlined it, and I could read it out loud, but where you, for me, pinpointed a true turning point in the world of college admissions. And it actually happened the year before I graduated from high school. And that is when the US News and World Report started making rankings a yearly thing. And people became obsessed with the idea that, oh, now I know what is the best. So instead of, and this is what you wrote was really great, was just instead of looking at what school would be best for me, people started saying, what school is the best? And that is where things changed.
And they took it a step further, and okay, now you can judge a school. So therefore you can judge the kid or the family
Yes.
that is looking at that school. Oh, that's a really high powered family because they're looking at top 10 schools. That school, that family, they're only looking at top 50s, or
Right.
right, assigning some value judgment to all of the people associated with a school. And there is no best school. And I say that knowing that the Wall Street Journal does publish rankings, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm involved in that package. One of my favorite stories is writing about most diverse schools, or best ROI, where it's more data driven, um, about salaries and things like that. But the best school for me is not the same as the best school for Jimmy and Johnny and any other generic J name. It's so specific to the student, to their goals in college, to their wants and needs and financial situation and all of that. So having this firm list of these are the best schools, and therefore you can, it's only success if you get into something on this short list. That drove so much of this very myopic worldview of what counts as success.
Well, exactly. And the idea that somehow this was going to resonate significantly in every facet of your life from there on in. It was all going to be about where you go to school. And the last time I checked, most people hiring were not saying, well, your school was ranked number 25 in US News and World Report, and yours was only ranked number 70. And so we're just going to only interview you because your school was ranked number 25. Or worse, right? We're going to hire you because your school was ranked that.
I
So,
mean, I will say employers could do better at this, right? They
yes.
choose what school, not right now because nobody's doing campus visits, but right, campus recruiting, that whole machine is very focused on a particular list of schools, often schools that are top ranked in a particular degree program, or that, enough employees went to, so they've got some ties there. Schools could open that door a little bit wider. And I actually think during the pandemic, companies have opened that door a little
Mhm.
bit wider just because they've had to, right? Everything's virtual. So in certain industries, I feel like that school name maybe does matter a little bit more. If you're going on to graduate school, not necessarily. If
Right,
you are going into certain industries, not necessarily, right? If you want to stay local, it doesn't matter if your school doesn't have a national name brand.
right.
And I think, yeah, it's just it's frustrating when people have that. The other issue with these families was they already had so much going for them.
Yes.
Right, these kids lived in fantastic houses with, they wanted for nothing. They would have landed somewhere fine anyway. These were
Yes.
good kids for the most part who would have gone on to college and thrived wherever they ended up. And even if they didn't, their parents had enough connections and enough money to help them stay on their feet.
Right. Well, so that was a huge piece for me. And I even say, I see it in my own life, right? So my parents were both teachers. My mom was a professor of nursing at a community college. My father taught English in a middle school in a town near here. I didn't know anybody. I didn't, where I went, actually, where I went to high school and then where I went to college had a big impact on me and my ability to network and meet people. That was really impactful to me. My son doesn't need that. He is growing up in a house where I have a network. My husband, his stepfather has a network. His own father has a network. He has opportunities. He doesn't have remotely the opportunities that some of these kids have.
Few
But
people
even,
do.
yeah, exactly. That's very true. But he's going to have opportunities. And from my perspective, none of that is tied to where he's going to ultimately go to college. Granted, I have 18 years of working in this industry to kind of get to that point, but I was very much struck by what you were saying too. It's not like the choice was community college or no college or USC. It was, in the case of poor Jack, it was going to
Southern
the
Methodist.
University of Southern wait, SMU, right? Southern
SMU,
Methodist?
yeah.
Yeah, Southern Methodist University or USC. Both perfectly lovely and fine institutions. So it's
Yeah.
just the mind boggles at I don't know what to call it other than just stupidity of it all. It just bad.
So one of the things that stuck with me, now we're going on, more than a year, was something that one of the judges said during a sentencing, and was, you know, these parents, those who pleaded guilty and were sentenced, they kept saying, I was just trying to do what was best for my kid. Right? This
Yes.
was done out of love. And the judge stopped one of the parents and said, are you sure? Like, is that really who you were doing this for?
Yes.
Your kid would have been fine. And it wasn't about getting your kid into college. It was about getting your kid into a very specific college that you deemed the right college.
Right.
And that kind of, quieted some of the parents a little bit, because it really was true that it
Right.
wasn't just to get into college writ large, but a particular one with a very fancy bumper sticker.
Yes, and I love that judge, and she's the one. So I don't want to give anything away, but I found this book, so I know what happens in it. Certainly, we know what's happened to all the parents who so far have pled guilty and been sentenced. And yet, still, when I was reading that part, I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Like, I know what's going to happen. Why am I? But it was was really fascinating to watch the ebb and flow of, were they going to get jail time? Were they not going to get jail time? And what did that come down to? And I love that judge because she's the one who kind of set that
She
precedent.
she did, and she made some really interesting rulings and some really interesting decisions about why she was still giving them prison time. All but one person so far, all but
Mhm.
one parent has gotten prison time. When one of the challenges, like there's a complicated legal element to this case of who's actually the victim here. And
Right,
prosecutors had to charge it that the victims were the universities because they were kind of cheated out of one of their spots, which is their property, or
right,
the College Board and the ACT were the other victims. In reality, these schools got tuition dollars from these families. Often they got additional donations beyond that. So there wasn't really a discernible financial loss
right.
to the schools, but there was reputational loss. And as we say in the book, there were victims here. There were the kids who didn't get in because these people cheated to get in.
Right.
And I think that was something that as we set out to write the book, it was really important to us to make clear that this wasn't a victimless crime.
No. And you did because for me, again, the when you were talking about the kids behind the pictures that were photoshopped, that was super compelling because they took a picture, they photoshopped a kid's face into it, but that was a real teenager accomplishing something real and amazing. And neither of those kids that you highlight in the book who actually did these things were even sniffing a place like USC. They, were going local. They were going, I think one went to a community college. And again, I love community college. My mother taught in a community college. It's just that they were getting to college the harder way.
Right.
And there were their accomplishments stolen by these families.
Yeah, I mean,
Not good.
USC wasn't on their radar, and they weren't on USC's radar, even though they were perfectly good kids with great this that happened to be great athletes.
Right?
And that was really heartbreaking reporting that chapter out. Just these kids who their success was stolen and used for
Yes.
somebody else.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I agree. I think that's a really challenging part of this. What,
Going back, I was just going to say, going back to the courtroom for a second,
yes.
that was so stressful. Like just sitting in the gallery, and again, I'm not a legal reporter. I've covered court cases before, but when you're sitting there for a sentencing,
Mm-hmm.
your stomach is in your throat. Like you're nervous just watching it happen, and you're seeing the defendant who is often quite emotional as well. And there's that minute before the judge kind of lays it out there of what the actual sentence will be, and you're just it's so nerve wracking. It's so tense for everybody. And again, these were not enormous prison sentences. This wasn't somebody being sentenced to 20 years or to death or something like that.
Right.
But there's still just this person's life is about to change so dramatically. Whether you like them or not, the defendant, this is an important moment in their life and you're witnessing it and you're anxious about it just
Right.
by being nearby.
I can only imagine, and the reality is for these are people who in their wildest dreams never imagined they would spend any time in jail. And I can imagine as I sit here and think, wow, 2 weeks, what's 2 weeks? But yet I wouldn't want to spend 2 weeks in jail. I don't know what that would be like or how I would prepare for something like that. And I think even at one night that you spend where you are locked up and not in control of your freedom would be hard.
Absolutely.
So,
I mean,
yeah,
there's a reason the judges generally haven't let them just serve home confinement, just do house arrest because they live in really nice houses. That's not a punishment
that
for
is
them.
not a punishment. Exactly. And it would be seen as exactly what would have been the case. Well, it would have been because law, as you pointed out, there wasn't technically anything that got stolen. And yet there wasn't a loss. And yet it would be seen for, oh, of course, these were wealthy people. They bought their way in, and now they're going to buy their way out of the legal implications of this. And so there is something very satisfying about watching prison sentences being handed down. to this
Yes.
group, I think. We're gonna take a quick break. And when we come back, I wanna talk a little bit more about Rick Singer, who is at the center of it all, and then also kind of dive into the aftermath and what you and I have seen that has changed, if we've seen anything change, and where we go from here. So we'll be back in just a minute, so don't go away.